My name doesn't matter anymore, not after what I've seen, but I've been a fisherman for 40 years on this isolated stretch of coastline, where the cliffs meet the sea like ancient sentinels keeping watch over secrets too deep to measure. I know these waters the way some men know prayer, every current, every shelf where the continental plate drops. Away into darkness, every warning my father whispered and his father before him. Dawn has always been my church, that fragile hour when the ocean exhales mist and the boundary between worlds feels thin as tissue paper, when you can almost hear the breathing of something vast and older than memory. But 3 months ago, everything I believed about, the sea, about reality itself, shattered like glass thrown against stone. I haven't taken my boat out since that morning, and the other fishermen have stopped asking why my nets stay coiled on the dock, rotting in the salt air while my hands shake whenever I look at the horizon. Some of them think I've lost my nerve. That age has finally caught up with me and planted fear where confidence used to live. They don't know that I'm not afraid of the ocean anymore. I'm afraid of what I understand now, what I can never unknown, and the weight of a secret that sits in my chest, like an anchor pulling me down into depths I never wanted to explore. Every fisherman on this coast grows up with the stories, the old warnings passed down like heirlooms rusted with time and disbelief, legends we laugh about over whiskey, but never quite dismiss when we're alone on the water, and the fog rolls in thick enough to swallow sound itself. My grandfather used to sit on the pier at dusk, smoking his pipe and staring at the place where the light dies on. The waves, and he'd tell me about the old agreements, the treaties between land and sea that existed before maps and motors, before we forgot how to listen to anything that doesn't speak in words we can monetize or control. He'd describe a feeling that sometimes came over him in the deep channels, an ancient unease that settled into his bones like cold water seeping through wool, a certainty that he was being watched by eyes that understood currents and centuries in ways human minds weren't built to comprehend. I was 17 when he went out one morning and never came back. His boat found drifting empty near the channel where the old maritime legends still warn fishermen never to linger. After the tide turns, they called it an accident, said he must have fallen overboard, but I remember my grandmother's face at the funeral, how she stared at the empty casket with something that wasn't quite grief, something closer to recognition, as if she'd been expecting this ending since the day she married a man who loved the ocean more than he feared its mysteries. I thought about him constantly in the weeks before it happened, dreaming of his weathered hands and the way he'd pause mid-sentence as if listening to voices carried on the wind. And I'd wake at 3 in the morning with my heart hammering and the overwhelming urge to go down to the docks, even though dawn was hours away. There was a restlessness building in me that I couldn't name, a pull toward the water that felt less like desire and more like inevitability, as if invisible threads were tightening around my ribs and drawing me towards something I'd spent 40 years circling without realizing it. My wife watched me with worried eyes as I'd stand at our kitchen, window in the dark, staring at the black line where sky became sea, and once she asked me what I was looking for out there in all that emptiness. I told her I didn't know. But that was a lie. I was looking for the answer to a question my grandfather never got to ask, waiting for the ocean to collect a debt I didn't know my family owed. The morning it happened, I woke before my alarm with that old unease already crawling up my spine like cold fingers, and I knew with absolute certainty that if I went out to the channel that day, everything would change, that I stood on the edge of a threshold I could never uncross once I stepped over it. But fishermen don't become fishermen by listening to fear, and besides, there was something else mixed in with the dread, a wild, desperate hope that maybe the ocean was finally ready to answer, that the silence my grandfather disappeared into might finally break open and speak. The sky that morning was wrong from the moment I stepped onto the dock, a flat grey dome pressing down like a lid ceiling. The world inside a jar, and the air tasted metallic and old, the way abandoned wells smell when you lean over the stone rim and breathe the exhalation of deep earth. I'd checked the weather forecast twice, seen nothing unusual predicted, but standing there with my coffee steaming in the pre-dawn chill, I felt the wrongness in my teeth, in the hollows behind my knees, in places that don't have names in anatomy books, but recognize danger the way migratory birds recognize magnetic north. The other boats stayed moored that morning, their owners sleeping or perhaps sensing what I was too stubborn to heed, and my footsteps on the wooden planks sounded too loud, each one a declaration of intent that echoed across water that had gone as smooth as poured glass, reflecting nothing, absorbing everything. I loaded my gear with hands that felt disconnected from my body, moving through the familiar rituals of preparation, while some deeper part of me screamed to turn around, to go home, to leave the ocean to its secrets and die ignorant, rather than enlightened. But my grandfather's face kept surfacing in my mind, the way he'd looked the last time I saw him alive, standing at the wheel of his boat, with his eyes fixed on the horizon, and a half-smile that spoke of anticipation rather than fear, and I realized I'd been waiting my entire life for permission to follow him into whatever mystery had claimed him. The motor's growl felt obscene against the silence as I navigated toward the deep channel, cutting through water that offered no resistance, leaving a wake that healed behind me, as if my passage meant nothing, changed nothing, mattered not at all to the vast indifference surrounding my small wooden vessel. The gulls that usually screamed and wheeled overhead were absent, the sky empty of everything except that oppressive greyness, and even the usual sounds of the coast, the distant bark of sea lions, the bellboys marking the shipping lanes, had been swallowed by a quiet so complete it felt intentional, curated, a stage set for something that required absolute attention without distraction. I reached the channel just as the sun should have been burning through the morning haze, but the light came diffused and directionless, turning the ocean into a sheet of hammered pewter that hurt to look at directly. And when I cut the engine to check my nets, the silence rushed in like floodwater, filling my ears with a pressure that made my jaw ache. That's when I felt it fully for the first time. Not just unease, but recognition, the certainty that I was no longer alone, that something vast and patient had been waiting in these depths and had finally decided the time had come to surface, to be seen, to break decades of careful hiding with an act of revelation I hadn't earned but couldn't refuse. My hands moved mechanically through the work of checking the lines, but my attention had fractured, split between the mundane tasks of my trade and a growing awareness of being observed, studied, weighed against some criteria I couldn't begin to guess. The water began to move beneath the boat, not with the random churn of currents, but with purpose, with intention. A shifting of massive weight that sent ripples spreading in perfect circles that had no natural source, and I found myself frozen with my hands gripping the net, unable to move or breathe or do anything except watch the surface tension break in ways that defied wind and wave. Something pale emerged from the darkness below, rising slowly enough that my mind kept trying to make it something ordinary, a whale, a dolphin, a trick of light on water. But the shape was wrong, the proportions impossible, moving with a deliberation that spoke of consciousness and choice rather than instinct or reflex. I thought of my grandfather. In that moment, wondered if he'd stood exactly where I was standing, feeling the same crawling mixture of terror and exhilaration, knowing his life was dividing into before and after with no way to stop the cleaving. The thing rose closer, details sharpening through the crystalline water, and I saw the curve of what could only be described as a shoulder, the sweep of what might have been hair flowing like kelp, but moving independently of the current, and then, God help me, I saw the hand reaching upward through the deep, fingers spread wide and webbed but unmistakably shaped by the same evolutionary blueprint that formed my own trembling hands. Time stopped meaning anything in that suspended moment. And I understood with crushing clarity that every story I'd dismissed, every legend I'd laughed away over beer and bravado, had been a message in a bottle finally washing ashore after generations adrift on tides of disbelief. When the head broke the surface, I didn't scream or run or do any of the things my body was begging me to do, because the eyes that found mine across 3 feet of impossible space weren't the eyes of a monster or a mindless creature of the depths. They were eyes that had seen empires rise from mud and crumble back to sand, eyes that held sorrow so deep and ancient it made my 40 years feel like a single heartbeat, eyes that recognized me not as an individual, but as a type, a representative of the species that had broken something precious and forgotten we'd ever held it whole. She was massive, easily matching my height and exceeding my weight. Her skin the grey-blue of storm clouds reflected in winter seas, weathered and scarred in ways that spoke of decades or centuries spent in crushing depths and razor currents, and tangled through her silver hair were strands of kelp and small shells that moved with her breathing like a crown assembled by the ocean itself to mark her as royalty of a kingdom we'd long ago stopped believing in. I stood paralyzed between reverence and terror, every rational thought in my mind screaming that this couldn't be real, while my body knew with cellular certainty that I was standing in the presence of something that predated human reason, something that existed in the gaps between what we know and what we've forgotten, and that my grandfather had died not from accident or misfortune, but from being chosen for an encounter I was only now beginning to understand. She remained there beside my boat for what might have been seconds or hours, time having lost all authority in her presence, and I watched as her webbed hand, larger than my own, the fingers longer and tipped with what weren't quite claws, but weren't quite nails either, rested on the weathered wood of the gunwale with a gentleness that contradicted her size and strength. The hand didn't grip or threaten, but simply touched, made contact, bridged the impossible distance between her world and mine, with a gesture so achingly human it made my chest constrict with emotion I had no name for. Her skin, where it met the wood, was slick but not slimy, textured like shark skin or wet. Stone polished by millennia of tides, and I could see the fine network of what might have been scales or might have been scars, forming patterns that looked almost like writing, like the ocean itself had inscribed its history on her flesh in a language that existed before words. The boat tilted slightly under her weight, a small adjustment that sent my heart hammering because it demonstrated her mass, her physical reality. The fact that this wasn't hallucination or dream, but solid presence that displaced water and exerted force, and breathed air that I could hear moving in and out of her lungs in a rhythm both familiar and utterly alien. I wanted to speak, to say something that would prove I was more than a frightened animal, but my voice had abandoned me completely, fled to some deep place inside where instinct still remembered when humans were prey and the ocean held gods we hadn't yet presumed to name. She continued to study me with those devastating eyes, and I realized she was looking not at my surface, but through it, reading something in my posture or my breathing, or the electric firing of my terrified synapses that told her everything she needed to know about what I was and what I'd come from and what I carried without knowing I carried it. The water around us had begun to move in ways that defied every natural law I understood, forming patterns that rippled outward in geometric precision, circles intersecting with spirals that suggested intention and meaning, a language written in fluid dynamics and surface tension that my conscious mind couldn't parse, but something older in me responded to with recognition that felt like grief. I watched the patterns spread and reform, hypnotic and terrible in their beauty, and realized the ocean itself was responding to her presence, that she wasn't simply in the water but of it, connected to every molecule and current in ways that made the distinction between creature and element meaningless. Small fish began to surface in the spaces between the patterns, dozens, then hundreds of them, not fleeing but gathering, forming their own spiral around my boat as if bearing witness to whatever was happening, and I understood with nauseating clarity that I was the only one present who didn't belong, the single wrong note in a symphony that had been playing long before humans built boats or learned to fear the horizon. Her free hand rose slowly from the water, and I flinched despite myself, but she made no move toward me, only gestured, there's no other word for it, at the assembled fish and the patterned water and the empty sky above, a sweeping motion that seemed to encompass everything and carry a weight of meaning I was desperate to understand, but lacked the capacity to translate. The gesture felt like accusation and invitation both, like she was showing me something that should have been obvious, something my ancestors once knew how to see, but we'd trained ourselves to ignore through generations of reduction and rationalization and the aggressive forgetting that lets civilizations sleep at night. I felt tears burning in my eyes. Without understanding why, some deep shame or loss welling up from a place I hadn't known existed, until her hand moved through the air and opened a door in my understanding that I'd never be able to close. Her gaze shifted slightly, no longer fixed on my face, but moving to my hands, my chest, my feet planted on the deck, and I felt exposed in ways that had nothing to do with clothing or vulnerability, and everything to do with being seen completely. Every choice and compromise and small cruelty that had shaped me visible to her in ways they'd never been visible to me. I thought of every fish I'd pulled from these waters, not with guilt exactly, but with a sudden awareness of transaction, of taking without asking, of treating the ocean as warehouse rather than sovereign territory, and I knew she could see that history written on me as clearly as the scars were written on her. But there was no anger in her expression, only that profound sadness, that weight of witnessing, and I realized this was worse than rage. This was disappointment, from something ancient enough to remember when we'd been better, when we'd known how to live as guests rather than conquerors. She made a sound then, not quite vocalization and not quite something else. A low vibration that I felt in my sternum before I heard it with my ears, and the sensation bypassed language entirely and went straight to some processing center in my brain that dealt in emotion and memory rather than words. The sound carried loneliness that made my 40 years of solitude feel like abundance, carried patience that made mountains seem hasty, carried a question I couldn't articulate, but felt pressing against my consciousness like fingers against a bruise, asking something of me that I desperately wanted to answer but didn't know how. The moment stretched and deepened, taking on weight and texture, becoming something I existed inside rather than simply experienced, and I understood that whatever was happening was changing me in ways that would only become clear later, rewiring something fundamental in how I perceived the boundary between self and world. Her hand remained on my boat, her eyes remained on mine, and the ocean remained perfectly still around us like a held breath, and I stood there trembling not with fear anymore, but with the terrible responsibility of being chosen to see something that would have been easier, safer, kinder not to know. I thought again of my grandfather, wondered if he'd felt this same crushing mixture of honor and burden, if he'd stood exactly where I was standing and made some choice I was now being asked to make, some decision between the comfortable lie of the ordinary world and the devastating truth of this one. The question hung unspoken between us, and I knew with absolute certainty that how I responded in the next moment would determine not just my own future, but something larger, some pattern I was part of, whether I understood it or not, and that she was waiting with the patience of tides and stone to see what kind of man I would choose to be when the choosing actually mattered. I found myself leaning forward without conscious decision, drawn by gravity that had nothing to do with physics and everything to do with recognition, the way a compass needle finds north or a migrating bird finds home across impossible distances. She remained utterly motionless, except for the slow rise and fall of her breathing, each inhalation lifting her. massive shoulders slightly above the waterline before settling back into the depths. And I noticed for the first time the gill slits along her ribs, delicate openings that fluttered with each breath, bridging the impossible divide between air and ocean in a way that made her seem less like creature and more like living equation, proof that the boundaries we'd drawn between possible and impossible were arbitrary lines drawn by limited imaginations. Her hair, if it could be called that, moved independent of any current, strands of silver and deep green drifting around her face and shoulders like living things. And I realized the kelp wasn't tangled there by accident, but woven deliberately. Cultivated, perhaps, decoration or camouflage or something ceremonial I had no context to understand. Small shells were braided into some of the thicker strands, catching what little light filtered through the morning mist and casting tiny rainbows across her weathered skin, and I found myself wondering who had placed them there, whether she had others like her, whether beneath these cold waters there existed an entire society we'd relegated to myth because acknowledging their existence would shatter too many comfortable assumptions. The webbing between her fingers was nearly translucent when light passed through it, revealing delicate vein structures that pulsed with what I assumed was blood, though part of me wondered if what flowed through her was something else entirely, some mixture of seawater and memory and ancient purpose that sustained her in ways human physiology couldn't explain. She tilted her head in a gesture so recognizable, so perfectly conveying curiosity and assessment, that I nearly laughed with the absurdity of finding familiar body language in something that should have been utterly alien. But the sound died in my throat before it could escape because her expression shifted in response to my almost laugh, something flickering across those ancient eyes that might have been amusement or might have been sorrow at how easily I reached for humor to defend. Against overwhelming emotion, the hand on my boat shifted slightly, not removing contact but adjusting, and I saw that the wood beneath her palm had darkened with moisture, the grain suddenly visible in sharp relief, as if her touch revealed the tree's memory of being alive, of growing in soil and reaching toward sunlight before being cut and shaped and pressed into service on the water. I looked from that darkened wood to her face and found her watching my reaction with intensity that made me feel like a text being read, a manuscript she was decoding with patience, born of having all the time in the world, or at least more time than my brief human span could comprehend. Something passed between us then. Not quite telepathy, but more like resonance, the way tuning forks vibrate in sympathy when the frequency matches, and I felt rather than heard her acknowledgement that I was trying, that my fumbling attempts to understand mattered, even if I was failing, that effort itself carried weight in whatever calculus she used to measure worth. The fish surrounding us had begun to swim in tighter circles, their silver bodies catching light and creating patterns that felt like language, like they were spelling out something crucial in alphabet of movement and reflection. And I understood they were part of this communication, extensions of her or messengers for her, the boundary between her consciousness and theirs, far more permeable than anything human neuroscience had room to accommodate. The vibration that moved through my chest intensified, becoming almost musical, and with it came not images exactly, but impressions, sensations that bypassed my visual cortex and went straight to some deeper processing center, where meaning existed before being translated into symbol or word. I felt the cold weight of deep water, the pressure of fathoms I'd never descend to, the slow, patient darkness where light was memory and sound was sight and time moved so slowly that human lives were barely flickers, sparks that ignited and extinguished between one of her breaths and the next, and the overwhelming loneliness of being one of the last, watching from below as the surface world changed and forgot and paved over the places where land and water had once spoken to each other with respect and reciprocity. The sensation was crushing, not physically but emotionally, a grief so vast and old that my own losses, my grandfather, my marriage, my years of isolation felt like small stones compared to mountains, and I gasped with the weight of it, tears now streaming freely down my face, though I couldn't have said whether they were mine or somehow hers. Borrowed emotion flooding through whatever channel had opened between us. She made another sound, different. From the first, higher and almost questioning, and I felt the pressure ease slightly, as if she'd realized she was drowning me in feeling, and pulled back, adjusted her broadcast to something my limited capacity could survive, and the tenderness in that adjustment, the care taken not to break me while still showing me truth, cracked something in my chest that had been calcified for decades. Her other hand emerged from the water holding something, fingers curled protectively around an object I couldn't yet see, and she extended it slowly toward me in gesture that felt ceremonial, weighted with significance that went beyond the physical act of giving and receiving. Every instinct screamed at me not to take it, that accepting would bind me to something I couldn't undo, would make me responsible for knowledge that most of humanity had successfully avoided for generations. But I found my hand reaching out anyway, palm up, trembling so badly I thought I might drop whatever she offered before I could even see what it was. Our fingers didn't touch. She was careful about that, lowering the object into my hand without contact, preserving some boundary or protocol I didn't understand. But I felt the displacement of air between our skin, felt her warmth, or perhaps her cold, felt the almost touch more intensely than I'd felt any actual contact in years. The object settled into my palm, with surprising weight, metal still cold from deep water. And even before I looked down, I knew my grandfather's locket, impossible and undeniable, the scratched silver case I'd seen in photographs from before I was born, returned from whatever depths had claimed him 5 decades ago, as if time and loss and grief were negotiable terms rather than absolute conditions. I closed my fingers around the locket, and the world lurched sideways, not physically but perceptually, as if the simple act of accepting this impossible object had shifted me into parallel reality where different laws applied and the membrane between past and present had grown dangerously thin. My grandfather's face flooded my memory with unprecedented clarity. Not the faded photographs I'd studied for years, but living memory, his laugh, the tobacco smell of his jacket, the way his hands had looked mending nets in the evening light. Details I shouldn't have been able to access because I was only 3 when he vanished, and memory doesn't work that way, doesn't preserve what we never consciously noticed. But these weren't my memories, I realized with creeping certainty that raised every hair on my arms. They were hers, given to me along with the locket, scenes she had witnessed from below the surface. My grandfather's last morning aboard his boat, the way he'd paused in his work to watch the sunrise, the peace on his face before the water took him. She had been there, I understood now, not as killer but as witness, perhaps even as guide, and the knowledge that his death had not been lonely accident but attended transition changed something fundamental in the grief I'd carried my entire life, transformed it from abandonment into something closer to ceremony. Though the word felt inadequate for what I was beginning to comprehend, the mermaid's eyes had never left mine, and in them I saw reflected not just my own face, but layers of faces, generations of fishermen who had glimpsed her or her kind, brief intersections between species that most had dismissed as hallucination or never spoken of at all, and I recognized with shock that she remembered them, held them somehow in whatever constituted her consciousness, that we were not anonymous to her even though she was myth to us. The profound loneliness I'd felt emanating from her took on new dimension. Not just the isolation of being among the last of her kind, but the specific ache of remembering individuals who could never remember you, of watching humans live and die in rapid succession while carrying knowledge of their grandfathers and great-grandfathers they'd never meet, being living archive for people who'd stopped believing in archives beyond what could be photographed and digitized and stored in climate-controlled facilities. She blinked slowly, deliberately, and somehow I understood this was communication, her version of nodding, or perhaps of sealing whatever exchange had just occurred, and I found myself blinking back in unconscious mimicry, my body responding to language my conscious mind hadn't learned, but my deeper animal nature recognized as grammar, of presence and attention that predated human speech. A fish brushed against the hull of my boat and I startled, breaking eye contact for just a second, but when I looked back, she had changed position slightly, settled lower in the water so that only her head and shoulders remained visible, and I felt the keen edge of panic that she was preparing to leave, that this impossible moment was already ending before I'd managed to understand even a fraction of what it meant. "Wait," I heard myself say, voice cracking after so long silent, and the word felt absurd, presumptuous, as if I had any right to ask anything of her. But she did wait, paused in her descent with expression I can only describe as patient, and I realized I had no idea what I was asking for, what I wanted beyond this not to end, beyond the ordinary world not to crash back in with its explanations and skepticism and inability to hold anything larger than human measurement could quantify. The locket was burning cold in my fist, metal warming to my body temperature, but somehow remaining ice beneath surface, and I understood it was not just returned possession, but evidence. Proof that would make everything that followed more complicated, because now I would have to decide whether to protect this moment or expose it, whether my responsibility was to her mystery or to whatever human hunger for verification would be unleashed once people knew that legends walked or swam or had never actually left, but only learned to hide from species that documented everything except what they couldn't monetize or weaponize or reduce to data points. She made a sound then, lower than before, almost subsonic, and I felt it as much in my bones as my ears, felt it reorganize. Something in my cellular structure, and with it came not images, but understanding, direct knowing that bypassed language entirely, that she was trusting me with choice, that my grandfather had made a similar choice in his last moments, that there had always been humans who knew, and humans who remembered, and humans who kept the old agreements even when those agreements had been forgotten by everyone else, and that I was being offered membership in that invisible lineage, if I was strong enough to carry the weight of it. My hand moved toward my pocket, where my phone rested, that reflexive modern gesture I'd performed 10,000 times without thought, but now the movement felt weighted with consequence. Each inch my fingers traveled opening distance between who I'd been and who I might become after this choice. The mermaid's eyes tracked the motion with what I can only describe as recognition, not surprise, but rather confirmation of something she'd already known would happen, and I realized with uncomfortable clarity that she had seen this moment before, had watched other humans reach for their devices, their cameras, their need to capture and prove and transform experience into shareable content. I could stop, I thought, could leave the phone in my pocket and preserve this as pure experience, unmediated and unverified, the way my grandfather must have kept his own encounters locked in silence for all those years before the ocean finally called him home. But my fingers had already closed around the hard rectangle of glass and metal, already lifted it into the space between us, and I watched something shift in her expression, not quite disappointment, because that would imply she'd expected better, but rather a deep, ancient sadness that suggested she'd stopped expecting anything from my species except exactly this, the inability to simply be present without simultaneously trying to pin presence down like butterfly to corkboard. The phone's screen glowed harsh and artificial in the natural light, an ugly intrusion. That made me acutely aware of the technological smell of it, the plastic and lithium and rare earth metals extracted from places I'd never seen by people I'd never meet. The entire global supply chain suddenly visible to me as wound running through the world's body, and I wondered if she could smell it too, if the chemical signatures of human industry were as obvious to her as blood in water. My thumb found the camera app through muscle memory, framing her in the small rectangle of screen, and the act of viewing her through this mediated lens immediately flattened her, turned her from presence into image, from encounter into evidence, and I felt something precious draining from the moment even as I pressed record, even as I documented the impossible curve of her shoulders breaking the surface, the kelp tangled in her silver hair moving with currents I couldn't see, the profound intelligence in eyes that had witnessed more human generations than I could count. She didn't flee, and somehow that made it worse. Her stillness felt like permission or prophecy, as if she'd already accepted that this was how humans processed wonder now, through screens and lenses, and the thin comfort of shareable proof that meant you didn't have to carry the full weight of mystery alone. Part of me wanted her to dive, to refuse documentation, to preserve herself as rumor and legend, but she remained motionless, except for the small adjustments her body made to stay level with my boat. And I understood with creeping horror that this too was gift, that she was allowing herself to be diminished into footage because she knew I would need it later, would need proof against my own doubt when the ordinary world reasserted its rules and tried to convince me none of this had happened. The phone captured perhaps 20 seconds before my hands started shaking so badly I had to lower it. But in those seconds, I watched her watching the camera with expression I'll spend the rest of my life trying to adequately describe, resignation mixed with something older than resignation, the look of someone who has seen her entire world change in ways she never consented to and has learned there's no fighting certain kinds of transformation, only bearing witness to them. She tilted her head slightly, almost bird-like, and I realized she was studying the phone itself with what might have been curiosity or might have been mourning, and I wondered what it looked like from her perspective, whether she could understand what it was for, whether her kind had their own ways of keeping memory that didn't require external devices, whether the very concept of needing proof was as alien to her as her existence was supposed to be to me. I thought about all the footage humans had captured over the years, all the blurry videos of things that might be something or might be nothing, how the proliferation of cameras had somehow made mystery more contentious rather than less, how proof no longer proved anything because proof could be faked, edited, generated by algorithms that had never touched the real world. The mermaid made another of those low sounds that resonated in my chest cavity, and with it came not vision, but feeling, the sensation of being known completely, seen through in ways that had nothing to do with sight, understood at depths that language couldn't reach and cameras certainly couldn't record. I lowered the phone completely, let it rest against my thigh, and in that gesture, something unspoken passed between us, acknowledgement perhaps that the recording was formality, necessary evil, but that the real exchange was happening in dimensions the device couldn't capture, in the way her gaze held mine with intensity that felt like falling and flying simultaneously, like drowning and finally learning to breathe. Underwater, she began to sing then, or not sing exactly because that word is too human, too bound up with melody and structure and performance, but she made sound that bypassed my ears entirely and seemed to enter through my ribs, through my solar plexus, through channels in my body I hadn't known existed until they started resonating with frequencies that rewrote everything I thought I understood about communication. The sound carried information, but not in words, delivered meaning through vibration and resonance, and suddenly my mind was flooding with images that weren't quite visions and weren't quite memories. Scenes that felt simultaneously ancient and immediate, coastlines that had never been mapped because they'd existed before mapping, before humans had developed the hubris to think reality only counted if we'd measured and named it. I saw my grandfather's face in those visions, younger than I'd ever known him, standing on a deck I recognized from old photographs of his first boat, and he was looking at something in the water with expression of wonder so pure it made my chest ache with loss for a version of him I'd never met. The man before whatever he'd seen had planted that haunted shadow permanently behind his eyes. The mermaid's song threaded through the image, layering it with context I couldn't quite translate into language, but I understood somehow that he'd been here, in this same deep channel, that he'd seen her or one of her kind, that the encounter had marked him the way mine was marking me right now, changing something fundamental in the architecture of who he was. I watched Vision Grandfather reach out toward the water with both hands, not to capture or claim, but to offer something. And I felt the mermaid's song intensify, as if this moment mattered enormously, as if this was the critical detail she needed me to understand. The distinction between reaching out to take and reaching out to acknowledge, between treating mystery as resource to be exploited and treating it as sacred thing, deserving reverence and distance. The image shifted, and I saw him pulling back his hands, saw him choosing not to tell anyone, saw him carrying the weight of that encounter alone for decades, because he'd understood instinctively that some things were too important to be reduced to stories told in bars. That proof would cheapen what had been precious, that the world wasn't ready, and maybe never would be ready to hold this knowledge without trying to weaponize or monetize it. The vision expanded outward from my grandfather to show me coastlines stretching back through time, and I saw others like him scattered across generations, fishermen and sailors and coastal people who'd glimpsed what lived beneath and had made the same choice. He'd made to keep silent, to protect, and I realized with growing horror that I was seeing a pattern of human contact that had been happening for centuries, maybe millennia, that these encounters weren't random but somehow orchestrated, that the mermaids weren't hiding from us so much as carefully selecting who they revealed themselves to, testing us perhaps, or trying to maintain some fragile connection between our species even as we'd forgotten they existed. The song carried undertones of desperate urgency now, and the visions showed me something that made my stomach clench with dread. I saw the ocean changing, warming, filling with plastic and chemicals, and sounds that disrupted everything, saw the deep places where her kind had lived becoming uninhabitable, saw their numbers dwindling, not dramatically but steadily, the way species disappear in the real world, through habitat loss and accumulated damage and the thousand cuts of human industry that never intends harm, but causes it anyway through sheer indifference. She was showing me extinction happening in slow motion, showing me that her kind were dying, not because we were hunting them, but because we'd made the ocean itself hostile to mystery, too loud and too warm and too polluted for anything this ancient and sensitive to survive. And I understood with crushing clarity that this encounter might not be test or treaty, but farewell, that she was revealing herself because there was nothing left to protect, because her kind's strategy of staying hidden had failed not through discovery, but through the casual apocalypse of our collective thoughtlessness. The weight of that understanding pressed down on me like physical force, and I looked at the phone in my hand with new comprehension of what I was holding. Not just device, but decision point, the fulcrum on which her species' future might balance in ways I couldn't predict or control. If I shared this footage, what would happen? Would it inspire protection and preservation? Would humans suddenly care about the ocean's deep places if they knew something this magnificent lived there? Or would it trigger hunting and exploitation and scientific capture? Would it bring researchers with nets and military contractors interested in biological secrets and tourists with cameras who'd turn these waters into theme park, destroying the last refugees through the sheer pressure of human attention that loved things to death without meaning to? The mermaid's eyes held mine with intensity that felt like drowning, and I realized she was asking something of me without words, presenting me with choice that my grandfather must have faced, the terrible responsibility of being witness to something the world wasn't ready for, might never be ready for, and having to decide whether sharing truth was act of preservation or betrayal. My finger hovered over the screen, where I could delete the footage, could erase the evidence and keep this moment private, could honor the old covenant of silence that my grandfather and others had maintained. But I could also feel the phone's weight as potential tool, proof that might matter, documentation that could shift funding or policy or public consciousness in ways that whispered warnings from dying species never seemed to manage. The song began to fade, not ending but withdrawing, pulling back like tide. And with its recession, I felt the visions loosening their grip on my consciousness, felt myself returning to ordinary perception of wooden boat and grey water and impossible creature beside me. But I was returning changed, weighted with knowledge that felt more like burden than gift, crushed under the responsibility of being maybe the last human who'd ever see what I was seeing, of holding in my hands both evidence of her existence and potential instrument of her kind's final destruction. She was still watching me, waiting perhaps for some signal of what I'd choose, and I realized that this moment was the real encounter, that everything else had been preparation for this decision, that she hadn't surfaced to be seen but to see what I would do with seeing, to measure whether humans had changed enough to handle mystery without destroying it, whether we'd evolved past our need to capture and classify and control everything we touched. The phone felt suddenly heavy as stone in my hands, its screen still glowing with the paused footage of her. And I understood that there was no right answer here, that both keeping silent and speaking out carried risks I couldn't calculate, consequences that would ripple out in directions I couldn't predict, that I was being asked to make a choice that should require wisdom I didn't possess, knowledge of futures I couldn't see, understanding of stakes that involved not just her species, but something larger about humanity's relationship with the wild and unknown, and sacred things we'd spent centuries trying to eliminate through the aggressive rationalization of the world. The mermaid's hand moved with deliberate slowness, reaching beneath the water beside my boat, and I watched with held breath as she retrieved something from whatever depth she'd emerged from, something she'd been carrying with purpose. And when her webbed fingers broke the surface again, they held an object so small and tarnished I almost couldn't identify it, until she placed it carefully on the wooden seat beside me with a gentleness that seemed impossible from a creature so large and ancient. It was a locket, the kind people wore generations ago, its silver chain green with age and encrusted with barnacles, and even before I touched it, I knew with certainty that made my chest constrict what I would find, knew it the way you know things in dreams before they happen, that terrible, prescient dread that comes from recognizing a story's inevitable conclusion. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely pick it up, the metal cold and rough against my palm, heavier than something so small should be, weighted with more than physical mass. And when I pried open the corroded clasp with my thumbnail, the rusted hinges protested, but gave way to reveal a photograph so water-damaged it was nearly illegible. But I could still make out the face looking back at me, younger and unlined but unmistakable. The same eyes I'd inherited, the same stubborn jaw, my grandfather staring out from 50 years ago when this locket had gone into the ocean with him on the day he'd disappeared and never came home. The impossible reality of holding it crashed over me in waves, each one stripping away another layer of rational explanation, until I was left with only the stunning fact of its presence, retrieved from whatever deep place he died and brought to me by a creature that shouldn't exist, delivered with intention that spoke of memory and connection that spanned decades. She had kept this, or someone like her had kept. It had carried it through 50 years of currents and storms, and the vast anonymous darkness of the ocean, had preserved this tiny fragment of my grandfather's life, and chosen this moment to return it, chosen me to receive it, and the weight of that deliberate care nearly broke something in me that had been holding steady until now. I thought of all the years my grandmother had spent grieving without a body to bury, without closure, with only the empty not knowing of the sea's silence, and here in my palm was proof that he'd been real, that his ending had happened in these waters, that maybe in his final moments he'd encountered what I was encountering now, and it had mattered enough that even his small belongings had been treated as sacred. The locket's chain slipped through my fingers like liquid time, and I looked up at the mermaid with tears I hadn't realized were falling, wanting to ask her everything, wanting to know if he'd suffered, or if he'd understood what was happening, if he'd been afraid or awed or at peace, wanting to demand explanations that her alien features couldn't provide, even if she'd wanted to. But her eyes held something that felt like answer anyway, a depths of compassion that spoke of having witnessed countless human endings and holding each one with reverence. We reserved for nothing except maybe our own species, and sometimes not even that. Why? Now, I managed to whisper, my voice cracking on the words, not expecting response but needing to speak into the enormity of what she'd given me, needing to push sound into the silence that surrounded us like cathedral walls. Why return this to me now, after all these years? She didn't answer with words, but with a sound that came from deep in her chest, a vibration that was part whale song and part something older, and it carried within it a feeling rather than meaning. A sense of accumulation and tipping point, of things preserved as long as possible, but now being released because holding on was no longer an option, because the time for keeping silent had run its course. I understood, with sickening clarity, that this wasn't just about my grandfather's locket, that she was returning things, plural, that there were other families with other losses whose tokens she or her kind had carried like prayers, that this moment of revelation was happening because the world had changed enough, or they had diminished enough, that the old bargain of silence was being dissolved, that they were emerging not from choice, but from necessity, making themselves known because the alternative was vanishing completely without witness, disappearing into extinction's unmarked grave, without anyone knowing what had been lost. The locket in my hand became suddenly representative of everything, every drowned sailor and lost ship and maritime mystery, all the oceans kept secrets being offered back to the land because the keepers were dying and someone needed to remember, someone needed to know what had lived in the deep places before we'd made them uninhabitable through our casual destructiveness. She began to sink then, lowering herself, gradually back toward the depths she'd come from, but she did it while maintaining eye contact with me, her gaze locked onto mine with intensity that felt like being held, like being seen all the way through to whatever core makes a person who they are. And in that looking, I felt her measuring not just me, but through me all of humanity, weighing us in some balance I couldn't see, judging whether we were worth this final attempt at contact, or if we'd already proven ourselves unworthy of the mysteries we'd been given stewardship over. I wanted to prove something to her, wanted to demonstrate that we weren't all thoughtless and destructive, that some of us still held capacity for wonder and reverence and the kind of restraint that lets wild things remain wild, but I didn't know how to communicate that across the vast gulf between our species, except by choosing what I did next, with the phone still clutched in my other hand and the footage it contained. The water rose around her shoulders, then her neck, then her face, those ancient eyes disappearing last beneath the surface like stars going out one by one. And I was left alone in my boat with a dead man's locket and living proof of impossibility and the crushing responsibility of deciding what to do with both, of choosing between truth that might destroy what it revealed and silence that might let something irreplaceable vanish without anyone knowing enough to mourn it properly, to understand what had been lost when the last of her kind finally surrendered to the ocean we'd made toxic to magic. The water where she disappeared remained unnaturally calm, a perfect circle of stillness spreading outward from the point of her descent like a wound in the ocean's surface. And I sat there clutching my grandfather's locket while trying to absorb the totality of what had just happened, trying to fit this impossible encounter into a worldview that had never allowed space for such things, that had reduced the ocean to tonnage and market prices and weather patterns without ever considering that it might hold Consciousness, intention, memory deeper than human recording could reach. But even as I struggled with disbelief, my body knew the truth of it, knew it in the way my heart was hammering, and my hands were shaking, and my eyes were burning with tears that came from some place beyond ordinary emotion, from that ancient part of us that still recognizes the sacred when confronted with it directly, that still knows how to feel awe, even when our modern minds have forgotten the vocabulary for it. I realized with sudden clarity that this was what my grandfather must have felt, this overwhelming sense of having touched something that existed outside the normal boundaries of the world, something that rewrote your understanding of what was possible and what was real. And maybe that's why he'd never come back. Not because the ocean had taken him with violence, but because he'd been shown something so profound he couldn't return to ordinary life afterward, couldn't pretend the mystery away and go back to fishing and small talk and pretending the universe was smaller than he'd discovered it to be. The locket in my palm felt like an inheritance of more than metal and memory. It felt like a passing of witness, a responsibility to carry forward the knowledge that we shared this world with others, that the boundaries between human and not human were more permeable than we'd convinced ourselves, that the old stories our ancestors told around fires weren't superstitions, but attempts to preserve truth we'd decided was more convenient to forget. I looked down at my phone, still clutched in my other hand, the screen showing the paused footage of her face, those eyes that held centuries of watching and waiting, and I felt the weight of choice pressing down on me with physical force, the understanding that what I did next would define not just how her story was told, but what happened to the last remnants of mystery in a world that had mapped and measured and explained away almost everything that once inspired wonder in the human heart. If I shared this footage, it would go viral within hours, would be analyzed and debated, and eventually either dismissed as fabrication or confirmed as discovery. And either way, the result would be the same. Boats would come to these waters, researchers and tourists and hunters, people with nets and cameras and the kind of curiosity that destroys what it studies, that can't leave things wild but must capture and categorize and ultimately diminish them by dragging them into human context where nothing retains its power. I thought about what she'd communicated through her song, those visions of broken treaties and forgotten promises, the sense that her kind had withdrawn not from choice but from necessity, from survival, instinct that recognized humans had become too dangerous to trust with knowledge of their existence. And here I was proving that assessment correct by my first instinct being to document rather than simply experience, to capture rather than witness, to turn sacred encounter into content that could be shared and consumed and ultimately dismissed by people who weren't there and couldn't feel what I'd felt. But I also understood her resignation when she'd looked at the camera, that sadness that suggested she'd expected this, that maybe this was part of why she'd surfaced at all, knowing that in our current age nothing remains private, that revelation was inevitable and perhaps better, controlled than discovered, that by choosing me, she was choosing how her kind would be remembered, if this was indeed their final emergence before extinction claimed them entirely. The sun had climbed higher, while I sat there paralyzed by decision, and with its rising the normal sounds of the world began returning, distant gulls crying, the rumble of another boat's engine somewhere beyond the headland, the ordinary reasserting itself over the extraordinary like water, flowing back to fill the space where something vast had briefly displaced it, and I knew my time for choosing was running out, that soon I'd have to start the motor and return to shore and face the question of what story I would tell and how much truth it would contain. I watched the footage one more time, saw her emerge from the depths in grainy phone quality that somehow made her more rather than less otherworldly, saw the moment her eyes found the camera, and something like sorrow crossed her features, saw the ancient intelligence that no special effects could fabricate and no rational explanation could adequately dismiss, and I understood that this decision wasn't really about belief or proof, but about what kind of world I wanted to live in, what kind of world I wanted to leave behind. In the end, I kept the footage, but I also kept the understanding that some truths need protecting more than they need, exposing that mystery serves a purpose in human life that certainty can never fulfill, that the ocean needs to remain large enough in our imagination to hold possibilities we can't quite confirm, because the moment we reduce it to only what we can prove is the moment we lose something essential about our own capacity for wonder, our own ability to live in relationship with wildness rather than dominion over it. I placed my grandfather's locket carefully in my tackle box where it wouldn't be lost overboard, its weight settling among hooks and sinkers and the ordinary tools of my trade like an anchor dropped into normal life, something to hold me steady when I was tempted to believe I'd imagined everything. And as I started the motor and turned the boat toward shore, I made a silent promise to the water and whatever dwelled beneath it that I would be a different kind of witness than the age demanded. I would tell people I'd seen something, would describe the encounter in enough detail that some part of the truth was preserved, would even admit to filming it, but I would also tell them the footage was corrupted when I dropped the phone, that all I had left was memory and this impossible locket and the changed understanding that some things matter more unseen than discovered, more mysterious than explained, more sacred than proven, and that the greatest gift we can give the world's remaining wild places and wild beings is the dignity of their privacy, the protection of our uncertainty, the grace of letting them exist beyond the reach of our endless need to document and define. The shore grew larger as I motored in, the familiar houses and docks taking shape, the ordinary world welcoming me back from the extraordinary, and I understood finally what had happened to my grandfather all those years ago, understood that he'd been given the same choice I was being given now, and had made his decision by never coming back, by choosing mystery over explanation, by becoming himself part of the ocean's kept secrets rather than betraying them to a world that wouldn't have understood what he'd been given. I've carried this weight for 3 months now, and every morning when I wake in my cottage overlooking the harbour, I have to decide again what kind of witness I'll be to what happened in those waters, what version of truth I'll offer to a world that seems to have lost its capacity for believing in anything it can't reduce to data and explanation. I told my story at the harbour master's office first, told it simply and without embellishment, described the creature I'd seen and the locket she'd given me, and admitted I'd tried to film her, but that my phone had gone into the water in my shock and the footage was lost, and I watched their faces cycle through concern and skepticism and finally settle on the kind of gentle dismissal people reserve for those they suspect are losing their grip on reality. And something about their disbelief felt like relief, like permission to let the mystery remain mysterious. Word spread through town anyway, as word always does in small places, and people asked to see the locket, which I showed them readily enough, let them photograph it and research the inscription, and confirm it had indeed belonged to my grandfather. But when they demanded proof of how I'd gotten it, I simply repeated that it had been given to me and left them to draw whatever conclusions brought them comfort. I stopped fishing. After that day, couldn't bring myself to return to those waters with nets and hooks and the industrial mindset that treats the ocean as a resource rather than a realm unto itself. And though some called it retirement, others whispered it was something closer to penance or grief or the kind of fundamental change that happens when the foundations of your worldview crack open and can't be put back together in their original shape. What I've come to understand in these months of reflection is that my grandfather made his choice and I've made mine, but they're different choices, shaped by different times, and maybe that's what she was teaching me when she surfaced that morning, that each generation has to find its own way of holding the sacred in an age that has different relationships with mystery and proof and the wild places between certainty and impossibility. I keep the locket on my desk, where I can see it while I'm writing these accounts, trying to find language for what happened that honors both the truth of the encounter and the privacy it deserves, trying to testify without betraying, to witness without exposing, to preserve something for those who come after without destroying it, for those who exist now beyond our sight and understanding. The ocean outside my window looks the same as it always has, grey-green and restless under the coastal sky. But I see it differently now. See it as a keeper of intelligences we've mythologized and forgotten, as a realm holding consciousness and memory, and forms of being that don't require our belief to remain real. And I understand finally that the old stories weren't primitive superstitions, but sophisticated attempts to maintain relationship with others we shared. This world with treaties encoded in tale and ritual that we broke not through malice, but through the kind of forgetting that calls itself progress. I think about her eyes often, that profound sadness mixed with something like hope, and I wonder if she surfaces still in those deep channels where the maritime legends say not to linger. Wonder if she watches other boats and waits for other witnesses, or if I was the last one chosen, the final attempt to bridge a gap that's grown too wide for crossing. The world keeps asking for proof I won't provide, keeps pushing me to produce the footage I claimed was lost, or admit I fabricated the whole encounter, and their suspicion bothers me less than it once would have, because I understand now that I'm not trying to convince anyone of anything. I'm simply trying to fulfill the responsibility that came with being chosen as witness, to hold the line between revelation and protection in an age that wants everything exposed and nothing left sacred. Young people from the university came with their marine biology degrees and their underwater cameras, wanted me to show them exactly where I'd seen her, promised they would only document and study without causing harm, and I refused them as gently as I could, tried to explain that some things matter more unmeasured than discovered, more mysterious than studied, that the ocean doesn't need more of our observation but less of our intrusion, more of our respect, and less of our certainty that we have the right to know and catalogue everything that exists beyond our ordinary perception. They left frustrated, and I felt the loneliness that comes with protecting something most people don't believe needs protecting. The isolation of standing guard over a mystery in a world that's convinced mysteries are just problems that haven't been solved yet, rather than essential features of a reality larger than human comprehension can hold. But I also felt my grandfather's presence more strongly than I had in 50 years, felt him standing beside me in that refusal, and understood that this was the inheritance the locket represented, not metal and memory, but a way of being in relationship with the world that chooses wonder over mastery, that accepts there are others here whose existence doesn't require our validation and whose survival might depend on our restraint. So I'm sharing this account knowing it will satisfy no one, will convince neither the believers who want concrete proof nor the skeptics who want clear admission of fabrication. And perhaps that's exactly as it should be. Perhaps the truth of these matters is meant to live in that uncomfortable space between certainty and dismissal, where mystery does its essential work on the human spirit, keeping us humble, keeping us open, keeping us aware that the world is stranger and more populated with intelligence than our current philosophies allow for. I still walk the shore every evening, still watch the water with different eyes, and sometimes in the failing light I think I see movement too purposeful for waves and too meaningful for random ocean life. And whether it's her or memory or simply the ocean itself acknowledging the watcher on its edge, doesn't matter as much as the fact that I'm watching differently now, as a guest rather than an owner, as a witness rather than a conqueror, as someone who's learned that the greatest wisdom isn't in grasping but in letting go, not in exposing but in protecting, not in proving but in preserving the space where wonder can still take root in hearts that haven't yet forgotten how to feel awe in the presence of what they cannot fully understand or control or reduce to certainty. The ocean keeps its secrets, And I keep mine, and the locket on my desk catches the light each morning like a covenant. Renewed, a promise kept, a bridge maintained between the world as we've made it and the world as it truly is, beneath our shallow certainty. What would you do if you encountered something that rewrote everything you believed about reality? Would you expose it or protect it? Subscribe to hear more stories from the edge of the unexplained.